All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into something pretty powerful, I think. It's the connection between worship and missions. And you sent me some excerpts from a book, Let the Nations Be Glad, by John Piper.
That's right. Yep.
And it's a pretty dense book, but I think we can definitely break down some of the core argument that Piper makes in this. And I think it's really could potentially change the way that people think about the whole purpose of the church, really.
Yeah, John Piper, he's been a pretty significant voice in Christian thought for a while now, and Let the Nations Be Glad. It lays out a pretty powerful and I think oftentimes surprising perspective on why missions exist in the first place. So yeah, I think it'd be great to kind of explore the heart of his argument today.
So, if you had to, summarize what Piper's getting at in this book, regarding worship and missions, like what would be the big takeaway? What's the headline?
Yeah, he states it pretty directly. Uh, the central point of his book is that missions exist because worship doesn't. And that's a statement that I think really challenges a lot of maybe more common perceptions of missions as being like the ultimate goal. He's saying, no, worship is actually what's at the very top.
So missions exist because worship doesn't. That's an interesting way to look at it. So why does Piper think that worship is so why does he elevate it to that primary position? What's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so his reasoning really stems from his understanding of God's ultimate nature and purpose. He argues that God is the supreme reality. It's not humanity, right?
Yeah.
And so if you consider, like the entire span of history, from creation all the way to the final consummation of all things, Piper suggests that when all is said and done and all the redeemed are gathered before God, missions as we currently understand it, this idea of reaching the unreached, that will no longer be necessary. Its purpose will be complete. But worship, this joyful adoration of God, that's something that will continue eternally.
So it's almost like mentions is sort of like a temporary, almost like a temporary assignment, like something with an expiration date, whereas worship
That's pretty right.
is forever.
Yeah, yeah. He describes it as a temporary necessity. It has a beginning point, which is, when there are people who don't worship God, and it has an end point, which is when all the peoples of the earth have had the opportunity to know and worship him. But worship, that abides forever. It's this constant eternal activity of the redeemed.
That's a pretty big shift in perspective. So if worship is that that ultimate thing, what then is the role of missions? Is it just to I don't know, kind of get more people in on the worship service, so to speak?
He says it's not just about that. He argues that worship is both the driving force and the ultimate aim of missions. So, think about it, like, what's the goal? The goal is to bring all the nations into this, as he describes it, white hot enjoyment of God's glory. So the purpose isn't just conversion. It's the glad and enthusiastic praise of God from every people group. And, he draws on scriptures like Psalm 97.1, which says, let the earth rejoice, and that powerful call in Psalm 67.3-4, where, talks about all the peoples praising God and being filled with joy. So, it's this universal heartfelt worship that he sees as the destination.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Like missions is the means of expanding the community of worshipers, right? But you also mentioned it being the fuel. So how does the worship that we experience here and now, how does that power the work of missions out there?
Yeah. So this is where I think the connection becomes really dynamic and really interesting. Piper contends that a deep and authentic passion for God in our own worship, that has to precede any genuine desire and ability to offer God to others through your preaching and missionary efforts. And he puts it this way. He says, you can't commend what you don't cherish. You know? And so if we as believers don't have a heartfelt joy and exultation in God, how can we sincerely, proclaim his glory to the nations and say, let the nations be glad? He points to Psalms like Psalm 104.34, which talks about like personal delight in the Lord, and Psalm 9.2 about declaring God's marvelous deeds as kind of examples of the inner worshipful heart that should characterize anyone who's involved in sharing their faith.
I see what you're saying. Like like the sequence of it is really crucial, right? Like worship isn't just the end goal, it's also the source of our motivation, right? Like to even go out and invite people to begin with.
Right, yeah. It all starts with us. Worship begins and ends in missions.
Yeah.
It's this continuous cycle. Our own encounter with God's glory in worship, it ignites this desire to see that glory spread, which then leads to more people worshiping and just this kind of overall deepening of the experience of God's glory in the world.
So this whole framework really seems to rest on this idea of God's glory being the absolute priority, right? So why is that so foundational for Piper's argument?
Well, he argues that that prioritizing God's glory, even above, a desire for human well-being, actually serves human well-being in the most profound and lasting way.
Hmm.
He believes that that a diminished view of God inevitably leads to a diminished and less effective approach to missions. And he uses this really powerful analogy. He says, when the flame of worship is burning brightly, within us, within our churches, the light of missions that shines farther and clearer into the darkness.
So you're saying like a half-hearted faith internally will inevitably lead to a weak outreach externally.
That's the direct correlation he draws. Yeah.
Yeah.
Churches that aren't fundamentally centered on celebrating and exalting God's majesty and beauty, they're going to lack that fervent desire to declare his glory among all peoples. And that's actually what Psalm 96.3 commands. And so where our passion for God is tepid, our zeal for missions will by necessity also be tepid.
And he even goes so far as to say that missions is the second greatest activity in the world. That's a pretty huge statement to make. So why second?
Yeah, because as we've been talking about, God occupies the first and ultimate place. Not missions itself. And Piper stresses that grasping this fundamental truth, it's essential for both the inspiration and the perseverance of those involved in missionary work. And he brings up William Carey, who's often called like the father of modern missions, who despite facing immense obstacles, he grounded his unwavering hope in God and in the certainty of his word. And he famously said, God's cause will triumph. And Carey's life really serves as a powerful illustration of how a vision of a sovereign and glorious God that fuels missionary endeavors. And so missions then becomes this indispensable means to the ultimate end of universal worship, and hence its designation as the second greatest human activity.
So now this idea that God himself has a passion for his own glory, I think that could be a challenging concept for some to fully grasp. It might even sound a bit self-serving,
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a paradigm shift for some folks. But it is really a cornerstone of Piper's argument. He posits that missions isn't even God's ultimate goal. Worship is. Even for God himself, he argues that God is utterly central and supreme in his own affections. There are no competing priorities when it comes to the supremacy of his own glory in his heart. He isn't an idolater. He finds supreme delight in his own infinite perfections. And in fact, the most intensely passionate heart for God in the entire universe is God's very own.
Wow. So you're saying like our desire to see God glorified isn't us imposing something on him. It's us aligning ourselves with his own deepest desire.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And this understanding, it really solidifies worship as both the fuel and the ultimate objective, right? So missions becomes a natural outflow of our own joy and satisfaction in God. It's a reflection of God's own inherent delight in being God. And as Psalm 117.1 exclaims, it says, "Praise the Lord, all nations, extol him, all peoples," and this reveals God's own relentless pursuit of praise from every corner of the earth. And so, if that's God's ultimate aim, Piper reasons, then it must also shape our ultimate aim in missions.
Now, Piper also draws a really interesting contrast between the true God and the gods of other nations. So what is it about, what's the key distinction that he's making there, especially in the context of missions?
Yeah, so he highlights the unique character of the God of the Bible. The one who exalts himself to show mercy. That's Isaiah 30.8, and the one who works for those who wait for him. Isaiah 64.4. And the seemingly paradoxical truth is that God's very greatness, it means that he doesn't need human beings to work for him. Instead, he magnifies his glory by actively working for those who who renounce their self-reliance and place their trust in him.
Yeah, and I think this ties into something that Paul said, right?
Exactly, yeah.
About God not needing anything from us.
Yeah. In Acts 17.25, Paul states that, that God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything.
Yeah.
And so Piper, he interprets missions in this light, not primarily as a recruitment drive, to kind of bolster God's workforce, but as a liberating endeavor. It's freeing people from the false and demanding gods of this world and inviting them into the effortless rest that Jesus offers in Matthew 11.2a30.
And the difference between our God and idols is pretty stark when you think about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He contrasts, the true God who carries us from our very conception, as depicted in Isaiah 46, with the Babylonian gods Bel and Nebo, who are so powerless that they have to be carried by their worshipers. You can read about that in Isaiah 46, 1-4, and Jeremiah 10.5. And so the true God serves, false gods demand service. God glorifies his immense power by extending mercy. False gods, they glorify their supposed might by enslaving their followers. And so this singular nature of our God, whose deep passion for his own glory moves him to acts of profound mercy, this becomes a really powerful and compelling motivation for engaging in missions.
So if that's the nature of God, what then is the essential message that we are called to share with the world through missions, according to Piper?
Well, it boils down to this incredibly joyful and shareable message. Rejoice in God. Be glad in God. Sing for joy in God. And he points to kind of a consistent theme in the Psalms, highlighting verses like Psalm 97.1, which says, "Let the earth rejoice." Psalm 67.3-4, which calls for this universal praise and gladness. Psalm 69.32, where the heart seeks God and finds life. In Psalm 70.4, where those who love God's salvation, they shout for joy. And so the core invitation is to find our deepest and truest happiness in God himself.
So the fundamental principle underlying that invitation is that
God is most fully glorified in us when we are most deeply satisfied in him.
Okay.
The essence of the gospel message, it isn't primarily about instructing people on what they must do for God to earn his favor or increase his glory, but rather inviting them to discover their own ultimate fulfillment and joy in God. Piper argues that the most profound sin isn't a failure to work for God, but a failure to delight in God in a way that reflects his inherent glory.
Now, Piper also emphasizes the consistent biblical focus on God's name in relation to missions. So how do the Old and New Testaments kind of connect on this particular point?
Yeah, so the Old Testament definitely lays the groundwork, by frequently highlighting the importance of declaring God's glory and exalting his name among all the nations. We'd see this, repeatedly in the Psalms and the prophecies of Isaiah. And then Piper really effectively demonstrates how Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament, they carry forward this very same emphasis on the significance of God's name.
So what are some of the key examples in the New Testament that kind of illustrate that connection between God's name and missions?
Well, Jesus himself, in Matthew 19.29, he speaks of those who've left, homes or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake. And so the underlying motivation for this, radical sacrifice in missionary work, it's the exaltation and honor of Jesus' name. And as the Son is honored, so too is the Father, as we see in passages like Mark 9.37 and the ultimate declaration in Philippians 2.10-11 that, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. The Lord's Prayer itself with its opening petition, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, Matthew 6.9-10. This is presented as this fundamental missionary prayer driven by God's own intense desire for his name to be revered and cherished above all else throughout the earth.
Yeah, and it seems like Paul's entire ministry was really consumed by this focus on the name.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, he considered everything else in his life as insignificant compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
And for whose sake he had suffered the loss of all things. You can read about that in Philippians 3.8, and his own sufferings, as he repeatedly states, were for the sake of the name, Acts 9:16, Acts 21:13. And his very mission, as he clearly articulates in Romans 1:5, was to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. Even the Apostle John, in 3 John 6-7, he commends early missionaries who went out for the sake of the name and received no support from the Gentiles.
And I think Piper even includes a quote from John Stott on this particular point, right?
Yes, he does. Stott, he powerfully highlights, that deep longing within Jesus that he should receive the honor and the glory that is rightly due to his name from every tribe and tongue.
Yeah.
And he underscores this absolute certainty of God's unwavering commitment to the glory of his great and holy name. For the sake of his reputation among all peoples, God will act. Mm-hmm. And the mission of the church, centered on the exaltation of that name, will ultimately and gloriously succeed.
No, this is a fascinating area, I think, that Piper also kind of delves into, and it's the role of love for the lost in missions, and he seems to offer a somewhat nuanced perspective here, suggesting that it shouldn't be detached from this central focus on God's glory.
That's right, yeah. While fully acknowledging, compassion for those who are lost as a noble and beautiful motivation for missionary work, he wisely cautions against allowing it to become disconnected from a primary and overarching passion for God's glory. And he cites John Dawson, who insightfully points out this, the inherent difficulty in sustaining a deep and personal feeling of love for such an abstract concept as the lost in general.
So where should our primary driving force in missions originate, according to Piper?
So Piper, he makes this really strong case that our primary and most enduring motivation should be a deep and abiding love for God himself. We share our faith and engage in missions not primarily out of pity or compassion for humanity alone, but first and foremost because we love God and we recognize that countless others are tragically separated from him and the joy of knowing him. And that's Ephesians 6:7 and 8. He even raises the challenging point that humanity doesn't inherently deserve God's love and that the ultimate aim should be to see Jesus receive the full reward for his suffering, which includes the worship of all peoples.
But he's not saying compassion is irrelevant, is he?
No, not at all. No. He speaks of what he terms God-centered compassion. So while being careful not to base our entire motivation solely on fleeting emotions or feelings for the lost, he acknowledges that God can and does give believers a supernatural burden of love and concern for others. And he cites the powerful example of Wesley Dewar's mother and her profound burden for the people of China and India. And he clarifies that genuine compassion and a fervent zeal for God's glory, they're not mutually exclusive, but in fact they're intrinsically linked. So God-centered compassion, it weeps over the spiritual destitution of those who are rejecting or ignorant of God's glory. But this weeping, it ultimately stems from the deep joy we ourselves have in God and a longing to see that joy extended to all. It's the sorrow of joy being limited in its reach.
So what is the ultimate call to action then that Piper issues based on this understanding of worship being primary and missions being the outflow?
The fundamental call is for us to be individuals and churches whose central theme, whose consuming passion is the absolute supremacy of God in every facet of life. He argues that without a profound and ever-increasing sense of the magnificent greatness of Christ, we will lack any truly significant and sustainable vision for missions. Similarly, without a deep and personal passion for worship ourselves, we will have no genuine desire or ability to draw others into that same joyful adoration.
And he really emphasizes God's own driving passion in all of this.
Yeah, he does. He describes God as having an omnipotent and unwavering passion to gather joyful worshipers from every single nation on earth. And so we're called to align our own affections with his, to willingly renounce worldly comforts and securities for the sake of his precious name, and to actively join him in his grand global purpose. And the inspiring promise is that God's own unwavering commitment to his name that will serve as our banner and ultimate assurance that we will not ultimately face defeat. That's Acts 9.16 and Romans 8.3539. And so he brings us back to his central thesis. Missions exist precisely because worship doesn't yet encompass all peoples. The Great Commission, therefore, begins not just with going, but with deeply delighting in the Lord. That's Psalm 37.4. And then declaring to the nations, let the nations be glad and sing for joy. That's Psalm 67.4.
And he concludes by pointing to the glorious vision in Revelation 15:34, where all nations will indeed come and worship the Lord.
So for us, as we've kind of taken this deep dive into Piper's perspective, what's the most crucial takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's the profound and inseparable connection between worship and missions. Understanding that worship isn't just a ritual or a Sunday morning activity, but the very, very foundational driving force and the ultimate glorious aim of everything we do as believers and as the church, including our engagement with the world.
Yeah, it really does shift your whole perspective, doesn't it? Like missions isn't the apex; it's a vital and necessary means to this greater and more magnificent end of global worship, all fueled by a deep, personal and ever-growing love for and delight in God himself.
Exactly. It's about grasping God's own intense passion for his glory and how that should radically transform our personal worship and consequently our entire approach to understanding and participating in global missions.
So as you continue to reflect on this deep dive, I really want you to consider this. What does it truly mean for you to delight in a God who ultimately desires that same delight from every single nation? How does understanding God's own burning passion for his glory, how does that reshape how you approach both your own personal worship and your understanding of global missions? It's a perspective that could truly revolutionize how we live and engage with the world. Thanks for exploring these powerful ideas with us today.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.